Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. Great program today. James Joyce is with me. He's a businessman, entrepreneur. He's been in journalism. He's been in public service. He's a fascinating guy. You're really going to enjoy it. Stay tuned. James Joyce, The Good Life is next. Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. So glad you've joined us. From wherever you are, you can always find us at goodlifetelevision.org. We're so grateful for so many of you joining us there from all around the world. I think like 100 countries in the last year. It's fantastic, so welcome. Goodlifetelevision.org is where you can find all the episodes as well as power clips where we kind of break down those episodes into moments that you'll like. And also Good Life Conversations podcast is up. And we've just launched over the last month, and we're really excited about the response. So you can always find us. It's at all the platforms, Spotify and all the other ones. So Good Life Conversations is the name of the podcast. And we're so glad you're with us. I'm so excited about my guest today. James Joyce is with me. James, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. James is a businessman, entrepreneur. He's been a journalist. He's been in public service, working as a director for State Senator Hannah Beth Jackson, which represents about 1 million or so constituents here in the area where we're sitting, which is Santa Barbara, California. James has had a number of involvements with boards and different foundations and organizations, so he's got a really diverse background. I was going to first ask you about that. How did you kind of end up with this resume that's kind of a mile wide as far as your areas of involvement?
An accident. You know, you just kind of stumble into things, and that's kind of been my mode for most of my life, right? When I was in college, I started as a student athlete, and most student athletes, that's enough, right?
Right.
Well, nope, not for me. I got involved in organizations and had meetings, and then became an RA, and then worked for the newspaper. Just always been involved in stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so that's just been part of who I've been as a youth and into adulthood as well.
And take us back to your youth. You grew up in Westminster, Maryland,
Yes, sir.
which is I think about 30 minutes from Baltimore. So
Yep.
tell us kind of what your upbringing was like and where you came from.
So Westminster is an interesting place. It's I later found that there's a Confederate general buried in a cemetery there.
Really?
The cemetery I walked past every day to go to middle school, but didn't know it until, of course, I was older. But learning about the history of Westminster, I mean, it was basically the holdup that allowed the Battle of Gettysburg to be won. There was a battle in Westminster.
Huh.
And so that there was just, knowing that there's this old school history, old school architecture. I mean, it's East Coast, but it's predominantly white, right? Predominantly conservative. In middle school, I ended up wearing cornrows, and that was a very risque thing in town, right?
Really?
And so, it was an interesting place to grow up. But there are areas of town where, my family, friends were, and we just kind of hung out, had a good time. I mean, it wasn't like it was dangerous or rough per se. I guess the only negative thing was my high school was termed Heroin High because there had been back in the late 90s a lot of heroin overdoses. From the time I was a freshman to the time I graduated 4 years later, I knew of at least 9 people, heroin, huffing, alcohol overdose, drowning, those kind of deaths. Through my town, and so that kind of lets you know there's not a whole lot to do in town, and so that's when those kind of issues tend to pop up, and so
Wow.
it's interesting to see the conversation around addiction now
Right.
because we grew up in that
Yeah.
environment, and so it's good to see that it's more widespread of a conversation, but it's a shame that it's still a conversation.
Right. So you were dealing with that back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So growing up, you mentioned that growing up is a significant minority in terms of the numbers. And talk about that. How did that impact kind of how you've set forth? Because I want to get into some of the stuff you're doing, which
Sure.
is really cool. But
Sure.
talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. I think like the weird thing is like my elementary school was named after a black man. It was like the black educator in the county. My grandma went to Robert Moton High School. That was a segregated high school. He was the principal. I went to Robert Moton Elementary because that was their way of preserving the legacy and history. And so it was odd that I went to elementary school named after a black man. I had a black art teacher at a young age, and so that's not a typical path for somebody that would have grown up in an area like Westminster. And so I did have some influences, but I definitely had issues with teachers not knowing how to deal with an outspoken black kid in their class, right? That's a challenging thing. They don't want their authority challenged in front of the other class or in front of the other classmates. And so I suffered several suspensions. When you hear about the statistics of how school districts suspend and expel black boys, particularly more than anyone else, that was me. I think by the time I was in middle school, I averaged about 6 or 7 suspensions a year.
Wow.
Never enough to get me expelled, but it was usually speaking out, being confrontational. I learned the word insubordination real early. It was like, you're being insubordinate, huh? What does that mean?
How'd I do that?
My mom made me look it up. She was like, you don't know what it means? Look it up in the dictionary. And so there I did.
Wow.
My mom was a major influence in me growing up, single parent. She was a social worker. And so to see other folks in the community respond to her in a way of respect and just the fact that she's being of assistance to them, whether it's parenting skills or getting access to food stamps or something. I mean, that's what my mom did, was a social worker growing up.
Wow.
And so I always joked to her about when she would try some new discipline technique on me. It's like, what magazine did you read that out of this week? Like, she's always going to some conference and trying something on me or something.
Wow. You ended up at Ohio University as a student athlete.
Yeah.
And well, I want to talk about that experience, but also you were, and I don't know if you're still on the national board of the Student African American Brotherhood.
I am.
But I know you were involved with that. But talk about that and your experience in college.
Sure. So when I went to college, I knew I wanted to get a journalism degree. And Ohio University at the time had one of the top 10 journalism schools in the country. I believe it was 5 at the time. And that of all the schools that I applied to, Ohio University was the only one that rejected me. They rejected me from the School of Journalism, and so I ended up canceling. I didn't go to NC State. I didn't go to Auburn. I didn't go to Western Maryland, which is now McDaniel College. I got into all of those schools, right? Pitt as well. It was the rejection from Ohio University that I was like, nah, y'all ain't doing that. Like, so I went and went into Ohio University through the College of Communications. I think it was a visual communications degree is what I started on, but worked closely with advisors to be able to get out and get my degree in journalism, news writing, and editing in 4 years, not 5, not 6, in 4 years.
Wow.
And graduated with that degree. And so, it was kind of going to school in Athens, Appalachia. It's a very poor part of the country, but it's a college town. And so it's about 5.5, 6 hour drive from where I grew up. Different state, whole different environment, whole different culture. And so I immersed myself in that campus culture, got involved, like I said, all kinds of things. I became an RA, involved in the NAACP on campus, worked at the student newspaper as I sold ads. I didn't write for it because I was so involved on campus. There was a conflict of interest on the news side, so I got to experience advertising sales on that side, which was an interesting mix, right? A journalism guy doesn't normally do that stuff, but when you're talking about like the interesting, diverse things, again, just falling into these things. I ended up working at the student newspaper because we were running a protest against the paper for their coverage or lack of coverage of black culture on campus. And the publisher of the paper was in this town hall meeting, and I was going in on him, and then he right there in the meeting says, well, why don't you come work for us? And I was just kind of like, that diffused the situation. I didn't accept right then and there, but that's the kind of environment that when you see something like that, it's like, okay, so being quiet isn't going to serve you too well. Just keep speaking up. And there's time and time again. I mean, in college, I held an event, was president of my fraternity, the oldest historically black fraternity in the country, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, founded in 1906. My chapter on my campus founded in 1919, right? An old historic chapter. became two-term president of the chapter, and at that time was an RA involved in so many different things on campus, and realizing that there's black campus, there's white campus. The two campuses didn't really mix. Like I was the go-between because I was on student senate. I was doing things where I was involved and exposed. I was the token, more or less. And so that led me to then host a program called Bridging the Gap, and it was basically bringing the leaders of Greek letter organizations, the white Greek letter organizations, the historically black Greek letter organizations, into a room for a reception to meet one another and have conversations. It was myself and another guy named James, who was in some of my journalism classes, and we were buddies anyway, and he was a president of his fraternity. It was the two of us there. That's it. No one else showed, right? And so looking back on it, that was the genesis of Coffee with the Black Guy, right? It was the same idea, the same notion, same concept of just sitting down, having conversations, and getting to know folks.
Right. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So you were a bridge builder in a sense. I mean, you were thinking that way even while you were in college.
Absolutely. And I mean, see, even looking back, I was a student athlete. Athletes don't get involved in organizations. They don't do things outside of that schedule. Right. And you know, I ran track, and a lot of the guys a lot of the folks in general that I ran track with, we all got involved on campus and did things. And it was, I guess it may have just been the era, it may have been the mix of folks on campus. But you know, that was the kind of path that we set while we were on the yard. And so, you know, again, it served me well. I didn't particularly know what you're doing then, and a lot of times when you're young, you don't know what you're stumbling through.
Right.
But you know, you just kind of stick to it, and eventually it'll work out. And in hindsight, you'll realize why the value in a lot of those things. Right. And now I can see that.
So you ended up being an award-winning journalist. I mean, so you did pursue the journalism thing.
I did.
But then you ended up in public service. To talk about, did you always have in the back of your mind that you'd end up in public service or public life in some way?
I always had in the back of my mind that I would not end up in public service or public life, right? That was always in my head. And as a journalist, I was, you know, just exploring curiosity, covering things. You know, first stories I'm covering are about tax abatements in the city of Gas City, Indiana, where the mayor is Larry Leach, and I have to interview him at the Ducktail Run, which is a classic car show. Like, come on, where am I right now, right? Like, that's what I dive into. And so seeing what I was doing in journalism, and right, you know, finding out, you know, you're looking for the conflict point. You know, find out where the friction is, and that's the story. And so you do your general coverage and your day-to-day, and you start to learn processes. You start to learn, you know, how things work, what budgets look like, when things are off, and then eventually you kind of realize that, well, I got the hang of this. I'm telling these people's story, and they're trusting me to tell their story in their community. And I'm an outsider in their community telling their story, and they're trusting me with this. And so you grow into that, but then also when you're looking at the conflict, I see what the problem is, right? And as the reporter, I see, okay, this person just needs to talk to this person. But my job is to report the story, not to make that recommendation. And so that always kind of frustrated me. It always kind of frustrated me as a journalist about this whole not getting involved, not being a joiner. When I would go to a new town, and I went to, you know, Marion, Indiana, Yakima, Washington, Toledo, Ohio, I'd get to a new town and I'd anchor into the NAACP or my fraternity members to be able to like get some grounding in the community that helps me network, that helps me get contacts. But at the same time, it exposes me to it limits my ability to connect being a journalist. It limits my ability to be a member of the NAACP as a journalist, because eventually I'm going to have to cover what they're doing.
Right. So that's a really interesting point about journalism. Find the friction.
Right.
Because that, and right now it seems like a lot of people are, you know, talking about the media a lot.
Right.
They divide us. But what you're saying is that's kind of the point. I mean, in terms of the story.
Yeah, the story narrative. Yeah. I mean, in J school, we're told that thousands of planes take off and land every day in this country, and that's not a headline. It's the one that crashes that makes the headline.
Right.
That's the story. And essentially, when you look at it that way, that is the role, right? When people are complaining about, the media dividing, like the media is the fourth estate of our government, right? Like we've bailed out car companies, we've bailed out airline companies, and we've just let the fourth estate disintegrate to a shadow of what it should be and what it used to be, because the primary role is to be the watchdog of our government. And when when you just looking, here in Santa Barbara, when you look at the newsroom, the number of employees in a newsroom and how that's dwindled over the past decade and maybe even 20 years, right? It's just been, that's a travesty. We're all worse because of it. We don't have as many watchdogs out there holding folks accountable, and therefore things go unchecked, and that continues a snowball effect.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
I had not thought about that. So you're in journalism, you end up going into public service, working with a state senator. Talk about that transition and coming to California.
Sure. So in 2008, I was in Toledo, Ohio, was the education reporter in Toledo. If you remember Toledo, it was Joe the Plumber in 08, right? It was battleground territory. Obama hung out in Toledo for 3 days prior to the final debate with John McCain. And so, I cracked that story because I was thinking about, okay, where in town could a bunch of people come and stay and be sequestered for a long time? And then I went to that location and I saw them doing a walk around with all the security agencies. And so that became my front page story. Obama's coming to town. It wasn't the best kind of scoop, but hey, it proved myself as a journalist in that newsroom at the time. And so that was an interesting place to be, where things are. It's a battleground city, battleground territory, right on the border of Michigan. And so seeing people coming and walk, doing precinct walking for both Obama and McCain and Sarah Palin. There was a day I was, in the press pool with Sarah Palin as she made stops in Canton, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio. And so, being in the press pool with the traveling gaggle of craziness, and being able to see that side of things, and then getting laid off a few weeks after that. It's journalism. I told you, it's just a shadow of what it used to be. That's been the trend, and so. It was a union open shop, a guild shop, which means that there were rules. The last people in the door, the first ones out the door. I left. It was 18 degrees and 12 inches of snow on the ground, and I decided to come to Southern California. I was sick of that. So I came out to Southern California, ended up through some networks getting a job at a for-profit education institute, and then that didn't work out for me because I felt ethically wrong about it. Ended up unemployed for a couple weeks. Friend who I was running a room from in her house was the lead organizer for Cause, a social justice nonprofit. She says, a friend of mine and former co-worker who's a city councilman up in Santa Barbara needs some help with his campaign down here. He's running for state assembly. That was Das Williams. I did an interview in Starbucks. I got hired on his campaign, and the rest is history. He ended up winning. Brought me onto his staff, did his communications and field rep for him while he was in the assembly. When Senator Jackson got elected 2 years later, she stole me away, brought me to Santa Barbara to first work as her deputy district director. So just in her district leadership as she's navigating, trying to represent 1 million people. And then as her district director for the majority of the time. And it's just been a delight to work with her and learn so many things from her, see her tenacity on issues, and, to even argue with her. Those were fun, right? She's an attorney, and she doesn't always, it's not always just asking questions nicely. She starts peppering in questions, and then sometimes I start peppering in responses and rebuts. And that's fun, right? And we both have fun and respect one another for that. But understanding how that plays into the process of making the decisions and making statements before crowds and making statements on the floor of the legislature. I mean, just seeing how all that unfolds has just been... And the difference with journalism is, when I was a journalist, I would see the problem. I'd say this person needs to talk to this person, and I'd have to report the story. Well, in public service, I see that this person needs to talk to this person, and I bring them together and have the conversation. Right. It's a much more empowering situation. But I see the natural transition into it based on my background.
Right. Well, and that leads us perfectly to the next question in terms of this initiative that you've been doing. It's called Coffee with a Black Guy. Yep. And I'm just reading about it. I thought, what a great idea. And what a especially in this time, it just seems like a great idea. So how did you get the idea, and then kind of what's your vision for it?
Sure. I'm not a genius. I stole it from law enforcement. I found out through a fraternity brother of mine that the city of Hawthorne, they started Coffee with a Cop in 2011. And I'd seen it in Oxnard, I'd seen it in Santa Barbara, I'd seen it around, Coffee with a Cop. But the concept is to humanize the badge and to be seen beyond their uniform. Okay, I get that. Something about me wants to be seen beyond this, right? Somehow it's deemed threatening. People hate it. There's animus in society against black skin. So I'm like, all right, I know how to. I understand that desire to change the narrative. Let's do something. Coffee with the black guy. And it just kind of naturally came out. I remember, probably it was 2015 or so, waking up one morning with the idea, calling one of my cousin and just like, hey man, listen to this idea. And he's like, oh man, that's a great idea. All right, I got to go to work. 2 hours later, I get a text from him. We own the domain name, coffeewiththeblackguy.com.
Oh,
nice. We had that and kind of sat dormant for about a year. Then rolls around the summer of 2016, and you have the killing of Philando Castile in Minnesota and Alton Sterling in Louisiana. The country is just reeling off of these high-profile sanctioned killings from law enforcement, right? And those are the headlines. That's what's dominating the news. Yet I'm walking around the streets in Santa Barbara, and people are avoiding eye contact with me, just acting like I'm not the black guy walking down the street and everybody else is white. Like, we know what's going on. Seems very inauthentic. And so I just decided to have black guy office hours, so to speak, right? Just pitch it out there, Coffee with the Black Guy. There's a lot of things that's going on that you may not know how to process. I've been dealing with race since I was in kindergarten, right? Not always knowing how to process it, going through that anger, but then coming through the side of seeing, okay, I can see both sides. I can understand why hate may exist, but I'd like for you to explain it to me. If you're a member of the Klan, explain to me, why is it that there's hate against me? And it's usually rooted in mythology, rooted in lack of contact and interaction. And so, not letting things emotionally rile me up and that getting in the way of being able to have a conversation and listen. It's very difficult for people to listen when your temperature's red. Right? And so just keep the temperature cool, coffee, connection, conversation.
That's genius.
Yeah.
That's genius. Listening.
Yeah.
What an idea. What a concept.
And it's perspective, right? It's building community, getting to know your neighbor. You can spin it any way you want to, but it's things we should be doing anyway.
Right.
We should be having authentic conversations. People say, I have black friends or I have black family members. It's great. What do you talk to them about? Do you talk to them about the things that you want to talk about? Or are you really allowing them to open up and creating a space to provide that real perspective so you can learn from that? There's a great value in this perspective, right? Being able to navigate this world from this lens, from seeing how people interact with this frame. It puts me, I feel, in a director's seat, right?
Right.
I walk into a room, I'm the only black guy in the room. I'm in control. I know that there's people who are either going to want to come to me because I'm the only black guy in the room or want to go away from me because I'm the only black guy in the room. I understand the lay of the land, right? And so once you kind of frame it and you look at it with that mindset, I hate to use some of these, motivational speaker terminology and stuff, but it's it's empowering to once you change the narrative and you start to look at things from a power stance, right? And it's not necessarily a supremacy power stance. It's a humble power. It's, if you look at where our country was before we had Barack Obama, our country needed this black savior, so to speak, right? If you look at, what things are unfold in our society, and then who is constantly the one healing, it's black women. Look at this past election, right? And people are like, oh, the Senate is no longer controlled by the GOP, and now whatever that means for folks, right? And so when you look at how these things unfold, Black folks have consistently stood up and showed up for America. The economic prowess of this country is based on the backs of Black folks. And until we fully recognize and really swallow that pill and address it, it's going to continue to be used against us as a point of division. I argue it's a homeland security issue. If you look at what happened in 2016 in our recent elections, and you say, oh, Russia interfered with our election, they fed false narratives. False narratives about what? Things that we haven't addressed anyway in our own country. I bet you if we sit down and really have the reconciling conversations and actions to go along with that as a country, they're not going to have anything to divide, right? And so it's not their problem, that's our problem.
Yeah, that's powerful. Great thoughts. I can't believe we're out of time, but I wanted to mention that in addition to all this other stuff that we've been talking about, Mr. Joyce is a candidate for mayor. I can see why now after talking to him for a few minutes. But powerful, great work with everything you're doing, and we commend you and applaud you. And we're looking forward to getting to know you better, and I'm sure a lot of people are.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to it as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time. When I wake up in the morning, I think of you, and I think of how can Good Life TV inspire you, encourage you, motivate you, empower you, because in a rough world right now, that's what we need to do. We need to stick together. We need to dwell on good things. We have 86,400 seconds per day. What are you dwelling on? Well, at Good Life TV, we want to help you dwell on the good stuff. Go to goodlifetelevision.org right now. goodlifetelevision.org. We'll see you soon. Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. So glad you've joined us. You can always find us at goodlifetelevision.org, all the social media platforms. It's so great to be here. It's so great that you're here with us. The goal here is to inspire, to encourage, to honor, to educate, and to empower. And we do that by telling great stories and meeting great people and introducing you to great people. And we have one of them here with us today. Maria Hernandez is with me. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Maria is the founder of the Vida Center here in Santa Barbara, California, and we're going to get into that part and the work that she's doing in a minute. But I wanted to kind of start. You have a powerful story. We were talking about this a minute ago. In what you and your husband Oscar have done, and then your vision and what you want to do is compelling and exciting. But start with kind of your upbringing. I know you were born and raised here, but talk about kind of your upbringing, your hardworking immigrant parents. Yeah. I know had a big impact on you, but talk a little bit about your upbringing.
My upbringing was pretty interesting. I was very fortunate because I was born and raised in Santa Barbara. So Santa Barbara has had a complete and utter unique impact on my life and what happened. So halfway up to my childhood, I would say we were pretty middle class, even though I had immigrant parents. And I say immigrant because I don't know if that even qualifies. My dad came over on the Bracero program. I don't know if you remember that. In the 50s and 60s. Okay. Workers were asked to come.
Yeah, right.
We didn't have to, illegally cross the border.
Right.
So fortunately, he was one of those people, and his employer sponsored him to get citizenship eventually. Oh. And then we ended up, and so somehow my parents ended up settling here in Santa Barbara, and that was...
Good choice.
Yeah. It has made all the difference in my life.
Wow.
So my parents ended up separating and divorcing when I was about 12. And we went from being lower middle class probably to being on social services with my mom.
Wow.
And so I always say I'm a product of nonprofit services and social services. And that really had an impact on the decision to become a social worker, a professional social worker.
Right.
And that's what I did at 17. I decided I was going to be a professional social worker. And I also decided at 17, I'm one of 9 children.
Wow.
Yeah. So I also decided that I wasn't going to become a parent until I could give a child what they deserved, which was everything I felt I had lacked in my own childhood, time, nurturance, love, attention. And I met my husband very sort of like coincidentally, and we were dating for 3 years. And as we started getting serious, I was going to move to LA to finish school out there. And I told him, I said, if this becomes a little more serious, I just want you to know that whoever I marry has to be okay with the fact that I may never have a child, or if I do, I also want to adopt, because I wasn't sure that I wanted to bring more children. My mom had done her part with 9 kids. Yeah, she had the numbers. So and then I had, Santa Barbara has been so unique, and it's interesting because in high school, the idea of adopting, that's where it came in. And I had a girlfriend, Suzanne. She's so amazing. He was probably a vegan before it was even coined, at least, popular language and culture. She rode her bike everywhere, and we talked about adopting in high school.
Really?
And not contributing to the world, overpopulation of the world. And so it was interesting. I had a very unique upbringing here in Santa Barbara. I was a soccer player, so I really got to enjoy my high school time. I'm a Don.
You're a Don.
Go Dons. It's interesting because I remember also growing up in Santa Barbara was very unique in that when my dad was still with us, he was a gardener. Probably would have been called the landscaper nowadays, but he was a gardener in the Montecito estates. And so I would work with him on the weekends.
Oh, really?
And I got to see the wealth that existed in this world. Literally, estates that you had to get on the little carts to go to like the, guest house, like a mile away. It was amazing. So all of that sort of like percolated in my mind. I didn't realize it at the time. I wanted to give back. I knew that because as having received what I received as a young adolescent through my mom when she was, struggling to raise the last of her 4 kids. And then also that idea of wealth and business always sort of, because my dad had his own business, his gardening business. So it just kind of created this very unique, I think now I look back on it, I can, in retrospect, in hindsight, I could see how it all kind of came together. But I've always been interested in building a business and wealth and serving humanity.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of where I'm at.
And you did obtain your master's degree in social work from UCLA in 1997 and became a licensed clinical social worker in 2009. So this is something you always knew you wanted to do. That was clear, which is rare for somebody that young to have that. But it's because of what happened to you, right?
It's because of what happened and some, synchronicity, I guess, or coincidence. I had good grades in high school, but, I was, even though my brother had gone to college, college wasn't spoken about. And so, and I hung out with all the, a lot of Montecito kids, and they all went off to college. And I don't remember even like applying to college. Yeah, it was really interesting. And coincidentally or synchronistically, my brother, who lives in Dallas, we were just talking about Dallas, he was already over at Carleton College in Minnesota. He was pre-med. And he came home one summer, and I had just graduated from the high school, and he's like, what are you going to do? What are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. Well, like, what are you doing with your life? And I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, you got to go to school. You're going to be a doctor. You should be a doctor like me. And just sign up for City College and be a pre-med student. That's all you got to tell him. You're a pre-med. Okay, so I was a pre-med student for my first semester at City College. Wow. And then I like sharing this story because it's funny how things work out. But I went into the Career Center one day, just synchronistically, randomly. And they did an assessment on like what your career interests might be. And I answered all the questions, and it actually said that I would, social services, human services, I think was the field, the helping profession was what I was geared towards because of my answers. And I saw a video on social workers, the whole gamut of social workers, schools, children and families, counselors, everything. And they all said the same thing. You have to get your master's in social work to make a living in this field. And so I was like, that's it. I know what I want to do. And I remember my brother checked in with me a few months later, maybe the second semester I was at City College, and he was so disappointed that I was going to be a social worker and not a doctor. He said, don't do it. Don't do it. Whatever you do, don't do it. You can help people by being a doctor. You're going to be 40, you have gray hair, addicted to coffee and cigarettes, and burnt out. You don't want to be a social worker. You can help people by being a doctor. And I was like, no, this is what I want to do. Wow. And so I ended up going into social work.
Isn't that amazing how, your experience, because of the situation you were in after the divorce and kind of having a more challenging environment where you relied on those nonprofits, those services, that had a major imprint, in what you want to do, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And good.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it's not great that you were in that position, but look what it's led to.
Yeah. I don't regret even going into social work. It's been a challenge, especially when you have that. Like for me, I mentioned I have that wanting to build a business, and social entrepreneurship is like one of my big passions. And so it's always like barely, sort of surviving with the social work salary and degree.
Right.
But to this day, I wouldn't change it for the world. Would not change it for the world.
Let's talk a little bit about the work you're doing in the Vida Center that you founded. You're launching. It's difficult during the pandemic to launch anything or do much, but you've continued on. But I want to get into a little bit of your story, because I think this is so perfect for today. The environments that we're in, it just seems like this is more needed than ever before. But maybe we could back up one step. And before we came on, we were talking about Greg Boyle. Mm-hmm. So Greg Boyle, for those of you who don't know, is the founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. They do unbelievable work, and he's become a national hero in many respects in this regard. He came on Good Life, and you saw that episode, but you were talking about him. What is it about him and them that inspires you?
I think it goes back to, growing up at 12. I mean, my parents were separated. Here my dad had owned homes in Santa Barbara, and then next thing we know, we're on public housing, because he sold his home and went and bought some property in Mexico and pretty much, abandoned his family. Yeah. So I decided, like I said, to go into the social work profession because I really wanted to help and give back, because I realized that I would not have gotten to where I had gotten without the help of nonprofits and social services. And I went into my master's in social work thinking that social workers were like social advocates, and we are. But the program that I got into at the time, and I think it was just, it didn't matter which program I got my master's at UCLA. But if I had gone to USC, it would have been the same thing, or any other program. But there was really a focus to training social workers to be clinical social workers, to go into more like the counseling and therapy, if you chose a micro path, meaning one-on-one.
Right.
There was this, and I was really disappointed. I was this close to actually leaving.
Really?
Yeah, because I thought, and I remember one of my advisors said, just finish your degree and then you can do whatever you want with it. So I had been really impressed when I was 12 or 13 by a rec program actually run by the city over on the west side, where we lived really temporarily for a couple years. And they took us out backpacking and camping, and we danced. It was kind of like probably the program that you guys have at at the village. And so that just, like you said, it imprinted my mind with something that I wanted to do for kids in the future. Mm-hmm. So I went to graduate school, and my second year at graduate school, UCLA, we went to a conference for social workers, I believe. It was like a national conference or something. And Father Gregory Boyle was there, and he was the keynote speaker.
Okay.
And he mentioned Homeboy Industries and what he had done. And I said, this is why I got my degree, because I want to build something just like that.
Wow.
And one of the things that struck me the most about his program, which is what I believe is really important and I want to incorporate into Be the Center, is giving young kids some, I call it personal sustainability, a way to make money, a way to just earn money. Because when I was, my work with my parents, my mom was a housekeeper at the hotels on, West Beach, East Beach. And she would take us on the weekends, and then my dad, would take us gardening on the weekends. And they paid us. They gave us money. And I was 12, and I was like, this is cool. And then I actually got my first job at 14 at Sam's To Go on Milpa Street.
Oh, really?
I was 14, and I was earning about $200 and something.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good money.
And so I remember, I could keep up with my friends that, parents gave them cars or paid for stuff. And I just remember always being, having this feeling that money is freedom. And not just freedom, but there's a sense of fulfillment in earning your own money. Dignity.
Yeah.
And to have fun, because that's a lot of times teens, there's just so many stressors right now.
Yeah.
So many stressors. And how are we helping them to actually have fun too?
Right.
So that's why it was so and Homeboy Industries, I think, was based on that model of giving jobs.
Right.
So.
They've got that thing wired down there. But yeah, you're right. It's not just because the way you're describing having fun is I work, I get that check, and I can have a little bit of fun, and I can feel good about myself, versus purposelessness, wandering. There's a big difference. And you would think, oh, no responsibilities, that's fun.
No.
Maybe for a week.
Yeah, exactly. For a little while.
Not long term.
Yeah, exactly.
You and Oscar made an interesting decision. In addition to having your own birth child, Eric, you adopted a sibling group. And I think it was about 2006 or so when you started to pursue this. Why did you decide to do that?
Again, going back to the upbringing here in Santa Barbara, and one of my best friends in high school talking about we were going to adopt someday. It's ironic. She ended up having 3 of her own children.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, she did. She didn't adopt.
Well, you took 3.
I took 3.
So, yeah,
we were actually only going to adopt 1, and then we said maybe 2. And honestly, looking back at it, 3 was not in our. It was not in our conscious decision to adopt 3, but that's how it turned out. But we had talked about adopting before we got married. We were dating, and my husband said, yeah, he's like, my husband was born and raised in Mexico. He did immigrate, so his family did immigrate many years ago, but I met him when he was about 22 maybe. And I was 19, and we started dating for 3 years, and then we kind of knew it was going to get serious. I moved to LA to finish school, and I just said, hey, if this becomes a long-term thing, we get married, I want to adopt. And he's like, you know what, that idea, I don't know why, but it's always struck a chord with me.
Really?
His grandpa used to take in young men in Mexico. He was born and raised in Mexico City. And his grandpa used to take in these, he's like, I don't even know who they were. They were just these young boys or young kids. And he's like, and then his grandparents. But his grandpa was the softie, the one with the heart. The grandma would be like, no, we can't feed anybody else. Oh, they need, a place to stay. So he always had that idea of helping. And so we made that conscious decision, and then we knew we weren't going to have children until we had both finished our education and were ready as parents, emotionally, financially. And we were married for 10 years when we decided to have our own first, if we could, because I didn't know if I was going to be able to have my own children. And so we had our son Eric in 2003, and then at 3 years we felt that was a good age to start thinking about adopting. And we were matched with we had decided on 2, and then we were going to have 1 more of our own. So we had our own, we were going to adopt 2, and then have one more of our own, so we'd have 4 kids, because we both come from large families. And we got matched early on with a toddler set, a sibling set, toddlers. And I just felt that, there was a lot of people that can't have their own children, and I knew they would be matched almost immediately if we passed up on them. And I had worked in the field of child welfare for, I think, about 8 years at that point. And I knew that the older children were harder to find homes for. And so we passed up the toddler set, and we passed up a set of 2 boys. They were just really far, like I think they were like in Riverside, and just being able to visit consistently was going to be hard. When you're matched, you start visiting, and we lived on the West LA, so by the time we got, it was just going to almost be impossible to really visit. Yeah. And then our social worker from the adoption agency sent us a picture of these 3 a sibling set of 3, Andrew, Marco, and Brenda. And Andrew was in the middle. And all I saw was my son Eric's face in that face.
Really?
And I was like, oh, I couldn't see nothing but his face.
Wow.
There was just a huge resemblance. And I asked my family, like, yeah, you're right. It's like, wow, it's so weird. And we had no desire for 3. We had not wanted 3. And she's like, I know you guys don't want 3, but I thought I'd send you these kids. And, they're kind of like what you want, because you've said you want older, harder to place. And they don't have any of the issues that, I'll be real honest. There was a whole list of things you say you don't want, like history of mental illness, history of drug use. I checked those off. My heart's not that big. People say, oh, your heart's so big. I'm like, well, I checked off all those things I didn't want. And she said, they've had a steady placement. They just need a home. And we ended up with going with that. Mm-hmm.
So you take in Andrew, Brenda, and Marco, and then, so you guys went through a tragedy, and and I know this is probably still very difficult, so I want to be real sensitive, but you went through something that it's like a nightmare for every parent, to lose a child. And so you lost Andrew. So I wanted to give you a minute just to kind of reflect. Tell us a little bit about who he was and his kind of special place in your heart. And then I want to get to this work and how this has been born out of tragedy in a sense.
Yeah.
But talk about Andrew for just a minute.
So Andrew, he was the youngest of the 3. So it was Andrew, Marco and Andrew are only a year apart. They're both born in July. They're 2 years, a year and 2 days apart.
Wow.
And then Brenda is older. They actually were 3 of 5. They had 2 older siblings still in foster care, Orange County. But Andrew, when we decided that we wanted to move forward with adopting them and having them come into our home, join our home through adoption, Andrew had just turned 6. So when we met him, he was 5, and then when they finally moved in, he had just turned 6. And Andrew, just a very, very special kid, very special. All of my kids, but particularly the ones that we adopted, they all have this very gentle, like noble soul. All of them. But Andrew's was like just so apparent, like from day one. He was just at 6. He was like the most considerate little kid ever.
Wow.
He had unfortunately he had a lot of he had like a developmental disabilities, like language, speech. He were in the foster home where he had been. They had nicknamed him, it was so sad, they had nicknamed him Mudo, which means mute in Spanish, Mudo, Mudo. He could speak, but he would like stutter in a way. It was hard for him to express himself. It was expressive language disorder, I don't know. They were diagnosed with everything under the sun.
Sure, yeah.
everything under the sun, and then some afterwards. So anyhow, but so he was, and he was also a very anxious kid, very anxious. But he was, I don't know if you know much about like behavioral stuff, but there's some kids that are externalizers in their behaviors,
Right.
and some that are internalizers.
Right.
Well, we're all like that, right? So even as we grow into an adulthood, right?
Yeah.
So Marco and Brenda were the externalizers.
Okay.
They're the ones we had to just, from day one, rages, tantrums, oppositional, defiant, conduct disorder, everything that probably could have been diagnosed with, they got diagnosed with. And Andrew was all internal anxiety. With Andrew, we, when this started happening with him, we had already had issues. Marco from day one was like our challenge. He was our challenge from day one, week one. I think we had a few days honeymoon. We had a few days of honeymoon. And we didn't realize how traumatized the kids were until we started seeing Andrew's stuff. And it all started with projectile vomiting. And you know, it's funny because I had been I'd been in the field for a while at that point. Wow. And I would have never thought projectile vomiting was actually real. Like it just, people have this, the anxiety, it's instantaneous, like milliseconds. The anxiety just, and it's out.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah, I never experienced it, had never had a child like in my caseload that had that. I don't have a history of anxiety like in my family for me to have been able to say, you know,
Right.
okay, this happens. And he also, he just struggled. I mean, and there was one night where he actually had hallucinations.
Really?
It was, and we were sitting there going, this isn't real. These kids didn't have the placement that you all sort of, like the child welfare system painted for us.
Right.
And that dove us into having, which I think it was a really good thing at that point, full-on psychological testing for all of the kids. And yeah, we learned a lot about them and their history because we talked to the birth parent, the birth dad, and learned everything. So everything I had checked off that I didn't want was all there.
Right.
Plus.
That's
Yeah, but he was a beautiful soul.
Yeah,
Beautiful soul. And that carried on. You know, eventually it's funny because going back to like what happened, I don't know. I just felt he had overcome his anxiety. But I think that he was so good at masking it.
Right.
And I do think that there were times where it wasn't a part of his, he overcame it for the most part. He was a very outgoing kid. Had lots of friends. It's hard to know. So it's hard to know. And going to what happened, it's funny that you say, and I know you do it out of respect, and I appreciate that. Losing a child, that definitely is a tragedy in and of itself. And it was so funny because after Andrew took his life, I couldn't say he passed. That didn't even make sense to me. He didn't pass. No, he took his life. And I think the only reason I can even sit here and talk about it is because he was adopted. I mean, and it's funny because we loved Andrew. Like Andrew, because he was the youngest and because he has such a beautiful soul, he was the one that was least affected in terms of his attachment. So my older two, and they were diagnosed. I don't think Andrew was. Maybe he was. I don't know. But he was able to. And I think it was because of his age and his closeness to our son Eric. So he was able to build attachment with us, and us with him. I cannot say the same is true for our daughter Brenda and our son Marco. And they were diagnosed with attachment disorder very early on. And not surprising, right? They were in foster care for 5 years before they came into our home and had multiple placements. Multiple. I think they had like 5 in 1 year. Wow. So it was pretty I mean, it's not surprising that they can't form a healthy attachment, right?
Right.
But Andrew did. And so it's interesting because, like, we really felt like, I cannot tell you that I love Marco and Brenda in the same way that I love my son Eric. It's different. And I know people will say, well, no, yeah, you can't. Well, for me, and I'm just going to be honest, and I know part of their trauma had to do with that inability for us to really form genuine attachments. But with Andrew, we did. And so when he took his life on May 15th, 2018, I almost feel like it's a tragedy upon a tragedy.
Right.
I always say, I don't know if I could have bounced back so quickly or have been able to talk about it. We started a remembrance for him 2 months after. If it had been my son Eric, my biological son, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I feel it's so painful. There's the stigma and the shame.
Right.
And the sense of responsibility as a parent,
Right.
all of that is mixed in there.
You've been through. And you decided at the memorial, you and your husband Oscar decided at the memorial that you were going to do whatever we had to do so that his life and death were not in vain. And you want to help other young people who are hurting and suffering in silence. And that's the purpose of the Vida Center. So we only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to say, I mean, this Vida Center, if you want to get involved, we'd encourage you to. You're taking young people ages 16 to 20 who are suffering in silence like Andrew. Maybe you don't see anything, but there's stuff going on inside. You're trying to help reach them. Is that right?
Yeah, they're the kids that, like kids like Andrew, you know, they don't come, well, he did come from a disadvantaged background, but, you know, a lot of kids, like when I was 12 and I came from, you know, public housing, I was obviously kind of at risk or disadvantaged. So I was identified. And I think there's a lot of young men, especially, like him. He's not failing school. He's not a delinquent. He's not, you know, he's just, and so I think those kids, a lot of those kids kind of just they fall between the cracks. Like no one's really paying attention to them.
Right.
And that they're not the super smart kids that are college bound and, you know, got programs for them. There's just, I think there's a whole, especially young boys.
Yeah.
Really.
They're trying their best to put up the front of strength and I'm okay, but when you find out what's going on, then it's not okay. So that is a noble mission.
Yeah, thank you.
So we definitely wish you well with that. It's the Vida Center.
It's Vida Center.
And is there a website yet, or is that?
Yes,
VidaCenter.org. Vida Center, so VIDA Center.org. Maria Hernandez. Thank you for what you're doing, and God bless you guys.
Thank you.
And,
this is great.
Yeah, we look forward to, I know it's the Turner Foundation, we look forward to partnering with you however we can to see you reach more of these kids, because today, I mean, even like this pandemic, suicide rates are up 90%. I mean, it's tragic what's happening today. I mean, right? So the timing of this work is so important. So bless you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll see you next time.